Most people start their morning with a cup of coffee without thinking twice about it. It is a ritual, a necessity, a small comfort before the day begins. The aroma, the warmth, the jolt of energy, coffee has become so woven into modern life that imagining a world without it seems impossible. But behind every sip lies a history soaked in blood, slavery, exploitation, and empire. Coffee is not just a beverage, it is one of the most powerful economic forces in human history, a force that reshaped continents, destroyed cultures, and built fortunes on the backs of millions of enslaved people. The story of coffee is not a gentle tale of trade and entrepreneurship. It is a story of how a single plant became a tool of domination, how entire nations were built on its production, and how the suffering required to grow it was hidden beneath layers of marketing, tradition, and consumer ignorance. Once you understand where coffee really comes from and what it costs to put it in your cup, you will never look at it the same way again. Welcome to Wealth Rewind, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Coffee did not begin as a global commodity. For centuries, it was a secret tightly guarded by those who controlled its production. The coffee plant is native to the highlands of Ethiopia, where legend says a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his animals becoming unusually energetic after eating red berries from a particular shrub. Whether that story is true or not, what we know for certain is that by the 15th century, coffee had made its way across the Red Sea to Yemen, where Sufi monks began using it to stay awake during long nights of prayer and meditation. They called the drink kawa, and it spread quickly through the Arabian Peninsula. Coffee houses opened in Mecca, Cairo, and Istanbul, becoming centers of conversation, politics, and intellectual exchange. These were not quiet cafes. They were loud, vibrant spaces where ideas flowed as freely as the coffee itself. But the rulers of the Arab world understood something crucial. Whoever controlled the coffee supply controlled a valuable resource. So they implemented strict rules to protect their monopoly. Coffee beans were not allowed to leave the region unless they had been boiled or roasted first, rendering them unable to germinate. For nearly 200 years, the Arab world held a total monopoly on coffee production. European traders who wanted coffee had to buy it from Arab merchants at whatever price they demanded. The Europeans tasted coffee, became addicted to it, and wanted more. But they were locked out of production, forced to remain customers rather than producers. This imbalance of power would not last forever, but when it broke, the consequences would be catastrophic for millions of people. The breakthrough came in the late 17th century when European powers began smuggling live coffee plants out of the Arab world. The Dutch were the first to succeed. In the 1600s, Dutch traders managed to obtain live coffee seedlings and transported them to their colonies in Java and Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia. For the first time, coffee was being grown outside the Arab-controlled regions, and the Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful corporations in history, took control of the trade. Coffee plantations spread across Dutch colonies, worked by enslaved and coerced laborers who had no choice but to cultivate the crop under brutal conditions. The Dutch did not just grow coffee, they industrialized it, turning it into a highly profitable export crop that flowed back to Europe in massive quantities. Then the French got involved. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam gave a coffee plant as a gift to King Louis XIV of France. That single plant was carefully cultivated in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris. A few years later, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu took a cutting from that plant and carried it across the Atlantic to the Caribbean island of Martinique. The journey was treacherous, the ship faced storms, pirates, and water shortages, and legend says de Clieu shared his own drinking water with the fragile coffee plant to keep it alive. That one plant became the ancestor of millions of coffee trees that would soon cover the Caribbean and Central and South America. It was a biological invasion that changed the world. The European empires realized they had found something extraordinary. Coffee grew well in tropical climates, it fetched high prices in European markets, and demand was exploding. There was just one problem. Growing coffee required enormous amounts of labor. The plantations needed workers to clear forests, plant seedlings, tend to the crops, harvest the beans, process them, and transport them to ports. And the Europeans had no intention of doing that work themselves. So they turned to the same solution they had already deployed for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, already one of the greatest crimes in human history, expanded in part to meet the demand for coffee. Millions of Africans were captured, chained, and shipped across the ocean in conditions so horrific that many did not survive the journey. Those who did were sold to plantation owners and forced to work in fields under the constant threat of violence, starvation, and death. Coffee plantations in Brazil, Haiti, Jamaica, and throughout the Caribbean became sites of unimaginable suffering. Enslaved people worked from dawn until dusk, often in sweltering heat, with little food and no freedom. If they resisted, they were beaten, tortured, or killed. The wealth generated by their labor flowed back to Europe, enriching merchants, traders, and aristocrats who never set foot on a plantation and never witnessed the suffering their fortunes were built upon. Brazil became the epicenter of coffee slavery. By the 19th century, Brazil was producing more coffee than anywhere else on earth, and it did so almost entirely through enslaved labor. Between 1800 and 1888, when Brazil finally abolished slavery, An estimated 1.5 million enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil specifically to work on coffee plantations. The conditions were so brutal that the mortality rate was staggering. Enslaved people were considered replaceable, cheaper to work to death and replace than to care for and sustain. Plantation owners calculated profit margins based on how much labor they could extract before a person's body gave out. Coffee was not grown, it was produced through systematic violence, and the profits were staggering. Coffee became one of the most valuable commodities in global trade, second only to oil in the modern era. European and American merchants built empires on coffee, funding banks, industries, and infrastructure with the wealth extracted from plantations. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and New York became financial powerhouses, in part because of the coffee trade. Meanwhile, the people who actually grew the coffee remained in chains, their labor stolen, their lives destroyed, their histories erased. Even after the formal abolition of slavery, the exploitation did not end, it simply changed form. In Brazil, after 1888, formerly enslaved people were not given land, compensation, or opportunity. Instead, they were replaced by waves of poor European immigrants who were brought in to work the plantations under contracts that were only slightly less brutal than slavery itself. In other parts of Latin America and Africa, colonial powers established systems of forced labor that functioned almost identically to slavery, just under different legal terminology. Indigenous people in Central America were coerced into working coffee plantations through debt peonage, a system where workers were trapped in cycles of unpayable debt and forced to labor indefinitely. In colonized Africa, particularly in regions like Kenya and Tanzania, European settlers seized land and forced local populations to work plantations under threat of violence or starvation. The pattern was always the same. Coffee required intensive labor, and those in power refused to pay fair wages or treat workers with dignity. Instead, they built systems of control that ensured maximum profit and minimum cost, regardless of the human toll. The modern coffee industry was born in this crucible of exploitation, and those origins never fully disappeared. By the 20th century, coffee had become a global commodity, traded on international markets and consumed in massive quantities across Europe and North America. But the people growing it remained poor, often desperately so. Coffee-producing nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia became economically dependent on a crop that enriched foreign corporations while leaving local populations in poverty. This was not an accident. It was the design of a system built during the colonial era and maintained long after formal colonialism ended. Multinational corporations based in wealthy countries controlled the supply chains, set the prices, and extracted the profits, while the farmers who did the actual work received only a fraction of the value. The pricing system for coffee reveals the depth of this inequality. Coffee is traded on global commodity exchanges where prices fluctuate based on supply and demand, speculation, and market manipulation. Farmers in countries like Ethiopia, Colombia, and Vietnam have no control over these prices. They grow the coffee, harvest it, and sell it to middlemen or large corporations at whatever price the market dictates. Often, that price does not even cover the cost of production. When global coffee prices crash, which happens regularly, farmers are pushed into poverty, forced to take on debt, sell their land, or abandon coffee farming altogether. Meanwhile, the corporations that buy, roast, and sell the coffee continue to make substantial profits because they control the brand, the distribution, and the retail price. Take a simple example. A cup of coffee at a cafe in New York or London might cost $5. The farmer who grew those beans might receive 5 cents. The rest goes to exporters, importers, roasters, distributors, retailers, and the various intermediaries along the supply chain. The system is structured so that the people doing the hardest work, often in the most difficult conditions, receive the smallest share of the value they create. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working exactly as it was designed. The legacy of slavery and colonialism did not disappear. It evolved into a global trade structure that continues to extract wealth from poor nations and concentrate it in the hands of corporations and consumers in wealthy countries. Every time someone in a developed nation buys cheap coffee, they are participating in a system that depends on keeping farmers poor. That is an uncomfortable truth, but it is a truth nonetheless. In recent decades, movements like fair trade have attempted to address some of these injustices by guaranteeing minimum prices for farmers and promoting better labor conditions. Fair trade certification is supposed to ensure that farmers receive a fair wage and that their communities benefit from the coffee trade. On the surface, this sounds like progress, and for some farmers, it has made a real difference. But fair trade also has limitations. The certification process is expensive and complicated, which means many small farmers cannot afford to participate. The premiums paid under fair trade are often too small to lift families out of poverty. And even fair trade coffee is sold through the same corporate supply chains that have historically exploited farmers, which means the bulk of the profit still flows upward. Moreover, fair trade does nothing to challenge the fundamental power imbalance in the coffee industry. It offers slightly better terms within a system that remains deeply unequal. The corporations still control the market, still set the prices, and still capture the vast majority of the value. Fair trade allows consumers to feel better about their purchases without requiring any real structural change to the industry itself. It is a band-aid on a wound that requires surgery. Then there is the environmental cost of coffee production, which is rarely discussed but impossible to ignore. Coffee is traditionally grown in the shade of tropical forests, where the trees provide habitat for birds and other wildlife while protecting the soil. But in the push for higher yields and greater profits, much of the world's coffee production has shifted to sun-grown plantations, which require cutting down forests and planting coffee in neat, exposed rows. These monocultures are ecological disasters. They destroy biodiversity, deplete the soil, require heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and contribute to deforestation. The drive for cheap coffee has turned lush forests into sterile farmland, and the consequences are felt by ecosystems, communities, and the climate itself. In countries like Brazil and Vietnam, the expansion of coffee plantations has led to massive deforestation, displacing indigenous communities and destroying habitats that will never recover. The same crop that was cultivated through slavery and colonialism is now being grown in ways that devastate the environment, all to meet the insatiable demand of consumers in wealthy nations who want their coffee cheap, convenient, and abundant. The modern coffee industry tries very hard to hide this history. Advertising campaigns show smiling farmers in picturesque mountain villages happy to be growing coffee for global markets. Coffee shops use words like artisan, ethical, and sustainable to sell their products at premium prices, even when the supply chains behind those products are anything but ethical. The image of coffee as a sophisticated, cultured beverage is carefully maintained, while the reality of how it is produced remains hidden. This is not accidental. It is branding designed to obscure exploitation. Consumers are told that their coffee choices matter, that buying organic or fair trade or single origin beans is enough to make a difference. But individual consumer choices cannot solve systemic problems. The coffee industry is structured to concentrate power and profit in the hands of a few corporations, while keeping farmers poor and powerless. Changing that requires more than buying different beans. It requires challenging the power structures that control global trade. So what does all of this mean for someone who just wants a morning cup of coffee? It means that something as simple and universal as coffee is actually a product of empire, exploitation, and inequality. It means that the reason coffee is cheap and abundant in wealthy countries is because the people who grow it are paid almost nothing. It means that the same dynamics that drove the slave trade and colonialism are still at work today, just in different forms and under different names. And it means that every time we drink coffee without thinking about where it comes from, we are participating in a system built on suffering. This is not a call to stop drinking coffee. That would be pointless. Coffee is too deeply embedded in global culture, and too many people depend on it for their livelihoods. But it is a call to recognize what coffee really is, a commodity whose history is inseparable from violence, and whose present is still shaped by inequality. Understanding that history does not change the taste of the coffee, but it changes how we see the world that produced it. History does not repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. The coffee in your cup is not just a beverage, it is a connection to centuries of exploitation. A reminder that the comforts of the modern world were often built on the suffering of those who had no choice. And unless we understand that, we will keep repeating the same patterns, finding new ways to extract wealth from the powerless, while congratulating ourselves on our ethics and taste. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.